Thank you. Thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for everybody organizing this. I really appreciate it. So yes, I've been writing about Burgess for quite some time. As I think many of you know, I got introduced to Burgess through A Clockwork Orange, Stanley Kubrick's famous film out of it as well. I saw that when I was about 16 years old, which many of us do. We go and look for these provocative things, and then my mind was blown, and I said, I have to go get the book. I went and got the book. I read that, and then it was just off to the races. It was like, all right, what else has this guy written? And I just started picking up book after book after book after book. And then in my undergrad, I had a bit of a focus on Shakespeare, and then I learned that Burgess also wrote about Shakespeare. And I was like, well, this is perfect. And I kept going down that road, and I tried to write about him in graduate school a little bit. So I did Nothing Like the Sun, his other famous book as well, about Shakespeare. You're going to learn a little bit about his engagement with American culture. You probably didn't know that there was a Shakespeare movie that he was optioned by Hollywood to write. He did it. He completed it. It was called Will, or the Bawdy Bard. It was going to have music. Burgess did all the music for it without even being asked. He just did it. And then ultimately, Warner Brothers scrapped the whole thing, and it basically sits in an archive now, this whole screenplay. His novels, Enderby, were also optioned for screen movies. His book, The Wanting Seed and The Doctor is Sick, were also optioned for movies. And he traveled all over the United States, things that I did not really learn about or even realize until well into my fascination with Burgess as well. In this talk today, I just want to give a brief introduction to who Anthony Burgess is, and then I'll get into sharing some of my work with you. So I've published some other articles on Burgess as well. I have an article in the book Burgess in France about a short story he wrote called 1889 and the Devil's Mode. For anybody who teaches English 242, it's a really good short story for that, because it's about the fin de siècle and the Belle Époque. And it has a lot of these characters that you teach in other aspects of the class that reappear. And he imagines them meeting and getting into arguments with each other and stuff. It's a lot of fun. So I have an article about that. I have an article about A Clockwork Orange. And I have an article that is kind of excerpts of his America stuff that was published in American Literary History. Because essentially at the core of what my argument is, too, is that Burgess was a type of American. He was here. He spent time from 1966 to 1993, traveling all over the country. He went to, I think it was 38 states that he visited. He stayed at least a night in each one. He visited over 100 different campuses, many of which I contacted for this work. I found news articles. I found recorded interviews. I found letters and archives that people hadn't seen in 50 years. Just a treasure trove of material that was essentially completely untapped. And if you know anything about Burgess as well, or Burgess scholarship too, this is a part of the discussion about Burgess's life that goes basically unstated. It's basically mentioned in footnotes. Oh yeah, Burgess spent some time in America. And then they move on to talking about, especially with a lot of British scholars these days as well, they move on to the British aspects of his work. He also lived in a bunch of other countries, so you'll see things focused on these topics, but no one has focused on this. And essentially, as I started, I was like, well, hell, this is amazing. This just dropped into my lap, essentially. And when I was at the University of Angers, France, in 2014, giving a talk, I met Dr. Ben Faulkner, who did his Ph.D. at Chapel Hill in the 1960s. And he gave a talk about his interaction with Burgess. He met him, he befriended him. They were friends for the rest of his life until Burgess died in 1993. And I asked to talk to him briefly, and he said, of course. And I asked him some questions, and he said, when you get back, if you're still interested in talking about the subject, here's my email, here's my phone, let's keep chatting. So I have all these recorded interviews with Dr. Ben Faulkner as well, who's still alive in Angers, France. And with that contact, I started reaching out to, well, are there any Chapel Hill professors who were there during Burgess's time? So I started just sending cold emails to all these people, just thousands and thousands of emails, asking if people had things, if they would be willing to talk. And it just started this kaleidoscopic kind of image of Burgess's time just started blossoming in front of me. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's not an article I'm writing anymore. It's probably a book. And then as the book started, one of my friends said, hey, tap the brakes, slow down. You don't have a Ph.D. yet. Get the Ph.D. first and then do the book. So I asked about that, and I got into a doctoral program with Dr. Andrew Biswell, who's Burgess's biographer and head of the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. And I got into the doctoral program and basically created a truncated little version of what is now for sale for MUP. And when I did that, I had a contact who worked in the Irwell editions at MUP, and they said, we want this as a book. Give us the rest of it. Because I wrote somewhere around 600 pages. All that was in my dissertation was about 250. And then basically unexpurgated the good stuff and put this into the almost 400 pages that are actually in publication. What I hope is going to come from this is that people will realize that Burgess was a type of American. He was here for 3 decades, in and out, all over the place. Also that he did a lot more than people tend to just focus on. It's not just a Clockwork Orange. As we'll get to a little, I think a little section that I read, and there's some explicit language, so forewarning to everybody. But it drove him nuts that Americans were so focused on A Clockwork Orange as well. Because he would complain, he said, I've written over 50 other books, and everywhere I go, everybody just wants me to talk about that damn thing. He often, too, refused to talk about it. He would show up for a talk about A Clockwork Orange, and he'd say, yeah, I'm not talking about that. And here's my new book, Napoleon Symphony, and he would start, reading from his next piece that he was working on, and so on and so forth. I hope that you'll get a more diverse image of Burgess, and you'll also get a bit of a history lesson on 1960s, 70s, and 80s America, and see how Burgess was involved in this kind of literary tradition, but also as a commentator on American culture. As well, and you might not like some of the things that I'm about to read to you as well. We'll see. Because he was a pretty stark critic. There's humorous things. There's it's kind of acute criticisms that he makes as well. But he was an incredibly diverse individual, as you see. His novels span all over the place. We have imagined histories of Shakespeare. We have dystopian fiction. We have a children's book. We have the time that he lived in Malaya, when he lived in Borneo as well, in the colonial office. He was an education officer. We have the Malayan trilogy. We have books that take place in Italy and Bracciano, where his house was as well. It's just all over the place. And he's this multifaceted individual who I think deserves a lot more attention on some of these lesser known aspects of his career. So you won't see a lot of comments about Stanley Kubrick or A Clockwork Orange in the book. Some you'll see a little, because Kubrick was an American, so I think it's important that he's in there a little bit, but that's not the focus. So here we go, 58 books, 33 novels. Some things, this is from the IABF website that you might not know about him. He wrote under 3 different pen names. He had Joseph Kell, he had Anthony Burgess, he had John Wilson. His actual birth name was John Wilson. Anthony Burgess was his middle double name, and then he went with that as he became an author, as his nom de plume or sobriquet. He was a pianist. He joked around, not a pianist too, but an orchestrator. He wrote tons of music, over 300 pieces of music for orchestra, for individual instruments. A lot of this is coming out now, where the Burgess Foundation is putting a lot of emphasis on all his orchestrations and trying to get them recorded, because it was largely overlooked during his lifetime. An interesting little fact about that, the first time that he had one of his orchestras presented was at the University of Iowa in the 1970s. And he recalls that time in Iowa specifically as being the kind of shining point of his entire life and career. All the books and everything didn't really necessarily mean a ton to him. He kind of joked around that I am a failed composer who also writes books. But as we see with all these novels, that was really, can we take him at his word with that? there's a lot that we can't really take much of Burgess at his word because he's saying a lot of different things. So yes, he wrote music. He played many different instruments. He knew somewhere around, I think, like 6 languages as well. Very cosmopolitan individual. Houses all over Europe too. He lived in Switzerland. He lived in Italy. He lived in England. He lived in Monaco, in Malta as well. He almost converted to Islam when he was in Malaysia. He became fluent in writing Arabic and learned Malay to mastery level so that he could talk to the local Malay people. And that's where we get the novels that are called The Long Day Wanes. He stole that from Tennyson. But in America, it's called the Malayan Trilogy as well. So we get 3 books out of that. And then we also get Devil of a State. That is a book that takes place in Borneo, right during the kind of colonial collapse. So he's also an individual who straddled both the colonial era and the post-colonial era because he was part of that system, criticized it while it was happening, and then criticized it after it had collapsed and moved on too. He wrote a stage play for Trotsky. He wrote a stage play for Houdini. He was all over the place, essentially, taking money wherever anybody would give him and just creating stuff without them even asking, really. And many of these, too, the reason why he might not be recalled much is because a lot of these flopped. Essentially, there's a screenplay, but it never got made. The 2 that did get made and were a pretty big success in Minneapolis, at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, which is still there. He did an adaptation of Oedipus by Sophocles, and he did an adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand as well, which went on Broadway, were very successful, and really created or put his name into that kind of theater discussion as well as someone that could be relied upon to do these things. So yes, he lived in New York, which we'll talk about today. He wrote a treatment for a film to Stanley Kubrick on Napoleon, which Kubrick eventually dismissed, and then we get Napoleon Symphony as well, which is supposed to be a novel set to Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, if you can actually do that. He tried. So he also wrote the script for the Franco Zeffirelli Jesus of Nazareth series that came out in the 1980s, which is still sold and spread around. That's him. He wrote a book called Moses. He wrote a book called Jesus of Nazareth as well, which is kind of, again, add a little historical fiction, right, coming up with different ways of interpreting the time, and specifically Jesus in those books and Moses. There's Orson Welles. He worked with Orson Welles on a Houdini. The Encyclopedia Britannica definition for the novel is written by Burgess as well, which is still there on the website, or if you order a copy. And he gave the eulogy address at Benny Hill, if anybody knows Benny Hill. Yes, he did the address at his memorial service. So already, I think you can see that you probably didn't know Anthony Burgess. You thought this was a kind of one-off, oh, he has a famous book, and that was about it. The man was indefatigable. He did not stop right until the end of his life. He was writing and composing music in his bed, ultimately dying of lung cancer in London in 1993. He actually, the last time he visited the United States was in New York City in 1993 to get a prognosis for his lung cancer. At Sletter Clone Memorial Hospital. I contacted them to see if they'd give me records, and they completely, they were like, no, sir, get the hell out of here. Because those are all confidential. But yeah, so the last time he comes, he's dying. He knows that he's dying. He's still giving lectures, even as they're saying your days are very numbered at this point. And he doesn't really let anybody know. And then he goes to London and dies from this disease caused by his profuse smoking as well. He started smoking when he was even before a teenager. His dad owned a tobacconist shop in Manchester, so there was just always tobacco. And if you've ever seen recordings of Burgess, you'll always see him with his panatella or a cigar or something. It's just constant, nonstop. So it's no wonder why how this led to his demise. So yeah, and if there's questions during any of this, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. Let me know. I made a little map with all the places that he's been. So one of the claims that I make too is, if anyone listened to, I was on the podcast for the International Burgess Foundation, and one of the questions was something like, "How much of an American was Burgess?" And I go, "Well, how much of an American are any of us, right? I haven't visited this many states in the country. He talked to far more Americans than I probably have talked to as well. Auditoriums of 10,000 people giving a lecture about Clockwork Orange. So how are we defining this as well? Burgess would define it as, I share the language with Americans. That was his, and whether it's tongue-in-cheek or not, he says it wasn't, but it still might be. He was a constant kind of jokester. He said, well, I am an American because I share the tongue. I share the tongue with Americans. I use Americanisms as well, but a lot of people too kind of called BS on some of those claims as well. And one humorous instance too, he said essentially Shakespeare is an American because the Shakespearean language that was used in Elizabethan and Jacobean times is basically closer to Bostonian English than British, which there's an inkling of truth there if you listen to speech pathologists, but it's not that easy. Essentially. So he would say things like this. At that point, he was on Dick Cavett and somebody yelled out from the rafters like, "You're full of shit." And he was like, "Ah, no," and talk. It's very humorous stuff. And we start seeing this in his novels too. So in 1971, the book MF comes out. MF is a structuralist novel, and then I'm going to get to the reading. A structuralist novel based on Claude Lévi-Strauss's idea of kind of cultural overlap. Structuralism across societies. And he focuses on the myth of Oedipus as it has been culturally kind of spread throughout the world. So he said, essentially, you see incest appearing in every culture in some way, shape, or form throughout history. And he said specifically, too, that Americans had an obsession with incest. There's a tendency for Americans to want to close off their borders and stay within the American family. He said in the 1960s and 70s, he said the identity politics era is kind of races attempting to not commingle, to stay within their different race and so on. And he essentially comes to the conclusion, which was, I think, progressive for the time, saying they need to get over all of this. This is ridiculous. He's waiting for what he called the global miscegenation, that all global races and ethnicities are going to just breed and create a new human in the future, which is just going to be some mishmash of brown and white, right? So he has MF where he says, I'm going to play this out with a black protagonist in the 1970s in America, and it's going to take place on an American university campus with these young people in search of this mythic author who turns out to be several people, and they all had basically committed incest together. And he's going to play this out in just constant kind of symbols and mythology and all this kind of crazy stuff. And it didn't land well with audiences, but I had to take it on for this book because really it shows a little bit about his thinking about America, because through this avenue of the novel, he communicates a lot of things that he communicated elsewhere. So for my dissertation, I had to come up with a way of talking about this in a critical way. I can't just say, well, Burgess published an article and then he had a book with the same language, right? For literary scholars in here, we say that's like the intentional fallacy, right? Just because someone published something there doesn't mean that that's the intent of the author. So I had to come up with something a little bit more complex, and I used Mikhail Bakhtin to talk about how language exists in this space where we all borrow it. Language is all of ours. We hear people say things and then we mimic it. We come back. We don't learn language from a dictionary. We learn it from our parents and the people around us. So there's this mass mixing of language that occurs. And what I used was Mikhail Bakhtin's theories about this to explain what is called the heteroglossia, the different tongues, essentially, and how they all come together. And I said, well, essentially, if we look at this, we stratify all of Burgess's communication if we look at the news article, if we look at the interview, if we look at the novel, the nonfiction, the private letters, if I take all of those and I start seeing patterns emerge, which are all over the place, it wasn't difficult, then I can start to make sense of this. And I can put into the book the fact that all these different mediums are showing an artist at work, essentially, how they are immersed in a culture, and then that culture permeates their kind of consciousness and subconsciousness, and then exists in the book. So what I will start reading is kind of introduction to the United States of America to Anthony Burgess. If anybody has the book, this is on page 59. But it talks about his commentary about the 1970s, and then it talks about the overlap between his life and his novels and how it comes out, and how these all these different ways that he communicated were kind of in discussion with each other. So that if something happened on Dick Cavett, all of a sudden we see something very similar happening in a novel. If something happens at Fordham University, all of a sudden we have something similar happening in a piece of poetry, in another lecture that he gives, in a private letter, and then ultimately in a published piece of fiction. And we can kind of track that lineage and go, oh, here is the inspiration. And then after all of that, after 600 pages of doing that, I can ultimately say that Burgess was a type of American. He was a person who spent a considerable amount of time here, and who's the culture, the language, the politics of America are just constantly appearing all throughout his fiction, both before and after. This country that we all live in was a point of constant inspiration to him. And once you start seeing it, it's kind of a skeleton key. You can't turn it off. And that's why basically in my book, there are mentions of every single piece that he ever wrote, over 58 novels, hundreds of articles, private letters. It just appears everywhere. And I would literally find things like a letter to his publisher with some funny comment that all of a sudden appears in a novel. And I'm like, oh, found where that came from. And that means that he was talking about this in this context, and then therefore this is the way that this idea kind of sprouted up. So without further ado, my brief little introduction there, not very brief. Let's get to the United States and America to Anthony Burgess. So in many ways, despite some of its alluring qualities, Burgess saw the United States in the 1970s as a misguided and misinformed country. For Burgess, the United States purported many things, but its slogan of democracy, peace, and individuality that emerged from the founding of the country and was solidified by the American Renaissance in literature terms were not promises it ever meant to keep. Quote, America says one thing and means another. It doesn't want the free individualistic person it pretends to value, end quote. In an interview at Rockhurst University in November 1975, Burgess expounded on this idea of American idealism being a farce. I hate to say it, he says, because I try to be a good guest, but America is totally dishonest. Even Russia is more honest than America. Going through Russia, one is aware that its citizens are free, yet they behave as it is assumed they behave in Soviet Russia. Russian people assume they are not in a free country, but they behave as if they have a great deal of freedom. In the United States, it's the opposite way around. Here, Burgess, the author, echoes what his character Mendoza had argued in his novel, A Vision of Battlements, his first novel, through what Bakhtin called the two speech centers or two speech unities, the unity of the author's utterance and the unity of the character's utterance, where the second unity is not self-sufficient since it is subordinated to the first, the author. Feel free to take a seat. You're fine. Mendoza states that regardless of being diametrically opposed governmentally with Russia, who resembled the end product of the socialist process, the two countries, the United States and Russia, still acted in similar ways despite vastly different governing bodies. In the book, he says, the character Mendoza says, we're both the same in a way. We both offer supra-regional goods, the icebox and the Chevrolet or the worker, standardized into an overcalled abstraction at a standardized production belt. 14 years before the Rockhurst interview in his novel, The Worm in the Ring, and through the same kind of subordinated speech, Howarth, the novel's protagonist, while in Paris, talks to an American wine salesman who explains why he had left the country, saying that Americans seemed not to even know there had been a large war raging across the ocean during World War II. This character says, America's an abstraction, the way I see it. It's lost blood so fast, it's only an idea now. I got so I couldn't taste anything anymore. It was all two dimensions and everything deep frozen. Russia and China and a bit of clear thought scaring the pants off everybody else. America's too darn clean. Having feared the United States' volatility, been allured by its economic prowess, and finally having lived in and traveled throughout the country, Burgess's opinions of the United States toward the end of his life were all refracted through his cultural awareness, essentially coming full circle by seeing the United States just as he had before ever visiting, as an unstoppable, barreling cultural, economic, political monster that was, quote, caught up in the exhilarating mindlessness, as good as a course of adrenaline injections, that could not help itself but for the working constantly, futilely, to achieve the mythic image it had spent so long crafting of itself. Since every, quote, social trend is every epoch has its own special sense of discourse and its own range of discursive possibilities, then every thought, feeling, experience must be refracted through the medium of someone else's discourse. This is Bakhtin. Through the medium of someone else's discourse. And its own range of discursive experience must be refracted through someone else's style, someone else's manner, with which it cannot immediately be merged without reservation, without distance, without refraction. Burgess, in his nonfiction, fiction, and journalism, echoes the same themes of the zeitgeist of 1960s, 70s, and 80s America. The cultural theme of full and destructive subsumation of the individual within myth was picked up not only from his experiences, but also, if not more so, from his reading of contemporary American literature. With such examples coming from Saul Bellows, Eugene Henderson, who greedily yearns, I want, in The Henderson Rain King. Gore Vidal's Myra Breckenridge, whose titular character lusts to capture and consume all forms of sexuality, and to Philip Roth's Peter Tarnopol in My Life as a Man, who cannot help himself from spreading his semen around other people's homes. Sorry, everybody, these are American novels. Philip Roth just died about a year ago as well. Indeed, literary American fiction that Burgess had read was alone enough to communicate to him and the world that the United States and Americans were insatiable, corrosive, eccentric, and diverse. And although he found this peculiar cultural concoction to be both fascinating and provocative, the inevitable deterioration of Burgess's once maligned embrace of the United States began in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Which is evident through his marked decrease in visits, more somber tone about the United States and Americans, and an increased lack of concern with the country as it was apparent across all of his modes of communication. Continuing to visit the United States all the way until January 1993, although much less regularly, these trips were also brief due to his failing health. But simultaneously, with his decreased presence was the near complete absence of the subject of the United States from Burgess's fiction after his metaphorical au revoir to the country in his final Enderby novel, Enderby's Dark Lady. The signs of Burgess's eventual retirement from cultural fame in the United States were existent in the earliest vituperations against the country, but as his commentary amassed over the years, a more grand narrative emerged in and evocative of American heteroglossia, or socio-ideological language, that reveals itself across his entire canon. Appearing on the Dick Cavett Show in 1980, Burgess expressed his belief that shows like Dallas had contributed to American self-conceptions being distorted, claiming that what American television had done, a medium consumed by Americans far more and in vaster quantities than literature, was reduce humans to bare elements, devoid of completeness and humanity, echoing the Federal Communication Commission's chairman, Newton Minnow's 1961 comment that television was a vast wasteland of material. In his 1982 article, Cardboard Character for the TV Guide, Burgess argued that the result of this was that American audiences were forced not to learn anything about real America, or anything for that matter concerning the real mentality of human beings, but instead were force-fed stories that leaned on the common denominators of sex and hatred. This is his quote about the show Dallas. This JR character is completely unbelievable. I fear that television may so simplify people's views of their own mentalities that we will become subhuman. I am a writer because I believe in humanity. I believe in people. I believe people are immensely complicated things, immensely interesting, immensely complex. They're not simple. They are not cartoon characters. This helps in breeding a generation that has a very simplistic view of what human nature is. Burgess continued, widening his argument to include the European receptions to these types of television characters, stating that the United States had also force-fed Europe with shows where nobody reads, nobody thinks, nobody generates an idea other than a money-making or murderous one. In fact, we are very rarely presented with a whole human being in American media. These types of characters in American television, Burgess gathered, only fed back into the United States' deterministic, quote, psychological tradition, which began with J.B. Watson and has culminated in B.F. Skinner, where all men and women are free and self-determined, all coinciding with materialism to result in a country that likes to think of human beings as simple moving matter, not complex mind. Taking on a similar subject in his 1974 Playboy interview, yes, they do have really good articles in interviews sometimes. They did, they're gone now. An interview he claimed was reported inaccurately. Burgess stated that Nietzsche's Superman, or the Übermensch, would have to be an American, or else the comic book character Superman was indeed a manifestation of Nietzsche's ideas baked into pop culture, or at the very least, the idea had to have been incarnated in America, a place with the super astronaut, the super politician, from Hamilton to Nixon, the super technician and the super scientist, even the super writer like Norman Mailer. This is a very American thing. Burgess explained that these entities were deemed super because they soared above the purely human, which was yet again both good and bad. He says, this probably explains why they make such a mess of the purely human, why such small considerations as concerning oneself with the rights of ordinary people go to the boards. Cartoons like Superman, Batman, and Captain Marvel had to originate in America. What occurred, Burgess contended, because these types of narrative frameworks were introduced and embraced by the American populace, was that citizens of the United States were conditioned with myths and fiction so that the romanticized lens distorted their realities by forcing their perception into neatly drawn, quantified, and qualified and defined American mythical matrices. So that when the unthinkable occurred, like a manned successful mission landing on the moon on July 20th, 1969, it would instantly be perceived as commonplace and expected, an event on which Burgess was commissioned by the New York Times to comment on. This was done through no conscious act of their own, Americans, but rather this reaction was the fault of the paradigm they themselves had spun, constantly creating an American culture, a culture with a predilection to be relentlessly unimpressed with life, disenchanted with the more common artful imaginative representations of the world, and therefore always in need and desirous of more and better. Although he adored the United States in many respects, it was a general detachment from reality that encouraged Burgess's opinion that the United States was a place capable and guilty of wholly forgetting the transgressions and achievements of the past, resulting in a kind of blind and bullish temperament that touted the idea of a sort of colonial democracy with the only permanent goal of teaching the world the merits of consumption. The exception with art and American literary experimentation, which was good as long as the exception was literary experimentation. It was good as long as it was inspired by erudition and coupled with genius. As a writer, the United States and American authors inspired Burgess to experiment and provided them with plenty to talk about and think about as he wrote throughout the 1970s and 80s, which is why the United States appears in the foreground of 5 of his 10 novels published between 1971 and 1984. Equally important to Burgess was the United States' obsession with myths and innovation that resulted in deeply embedded cultural convictions, which Burgess found endlessly provocative and inspiring aesthetically, although not necessarily socially inviting or beneficial. This myth building carried out in all facets of American daily life, Burgess partially attributed to the United States' obsession with and productivity in the art of cinema and the entertainment industry, which he felt ended up over time turning most institutions into myth, resulting in the myth trying to, quote, self-consciously maintain itself, therefore inevitably leading to disaster due to the unattainable and unrealistic goals and pursuits Americans strive for. In fact, one of the United States' most celebrated forms of business was the Hollywood film industry, whose sole purpose was to explore the realm and possibilities of visual storytelling. And these visual representations had soon become more vivid and realistic than anything that had ever been made before them. So that by the 1960s and 1970s, film culture had permeated American life in a way that it never had before and never has since. The verisimilitude of Hollywood films had paradoxically altered reality, with films such as Easy Rider in 1969 being a reflection of this specifically for the hippie demographic, thus furthering the gap between reality and make-believe. The counterculture had produced a film evocative and emblematic of its own intentions and philosophies, while also compounding this image by influencing the very same counterculture that had provoked its creation. The two worlds, myth, visual storytelling versus reality, relied upon each through the use and understanding of symbols, iconography, characters, and tales, which soon supplanted the more mundane materiality of everyday American life. More broadly, the white picket fences, the combat hero, the cowboy, the businessman, the hippie, the black radical, and the subservient housewife. All symbols and tropes perpetuated by and mirrored back onto the society that created the medium to begin with. Although Burgess understood that the United States had economically, artistically, and politically advanced by living according to various social and cultural doctrines and myths, he felt that many of these aspects of the cultural doctrines and myths, or the many aspects of the American life, also acted as a detriment to the psyche of the American soul, or at least, very least, threw the country's understanding of itself into disarray. A point of discussion that continues at the writing of this book, with Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War, and John Meacham's The Soul of America. Books that continue to attempt to put into perspective what progress looks like in the American historical element by dispelling and contextualizing certain rosy retrospective American lore. Even though the United States had proved itself by Burgess's standards in the 1960s to be far from perfect and not quite excellent, as he put it, he was invited to a lecture to talk about on excellence, and he said, America is not excellence, to a huge audience of Americans. And he said, to be excellent, one must first be docile, must not produce pain. He says, therefore, America is not excellent, and then he goes into it. And as a side note on that, too, it drove him nuts at that conference because he got no standing ovation. He got no one that talked to him afterwards. But then a football player came up and gave a speech about going for the touchdown and let's go. And everybody, threw their hats in the air, screamed, and he was like, "What the hell's wrong with this place?" And there was a physicist and a geologist, and all these people gave speeches. And he said the only one, is Fran Tarkenton. If anyone, he said Fran Tarkenton came out and gave the speech that actually got people out of their seats. And he basically was like, "All right, I'm done with this place." So I'm going to skip forward a little bit to get to one of the main books that inspired the way that he saw America. And that was Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, which he cited quite frequently as a way to kind of expose what he saw going on, especially in the 60s and 70s. He talks about the My Lai massacre as being when Americans finally realized that they were not perfect and that the word sin appears in bold-faced letters in newspapers. He said you couldn't escape it. Americans always thought they were exceptional until this happened, and then it all changes. So in the United States struggles with truth, the propaganda of the 1940s, the presidential lies of the 60s and 70s. He went on to say several other themes. Self-awareness was a problem, honesty, and the overall genuineness are reflected upon in Burgess's book 1985 that was written in 1978. He argues in a Socratic catechistic dialogue between two personages that the United States had these problems because of excessive hubris, not to be, Burgess appears to suggest, equated with the type of superiority complexes found in dictatorships that had occurred in Europe, but rather as a national character flaw forged out of the United States' revolutionary beginnings. This led, the text argues, to the United States government overcompensating for a perceived sense of superiority, therefore resulting in a litany of militaristic and social faux pas. This overconfidence was also a side effect of a naive and presumptuousness only existent in a nation that was new to such potent and vast power. This is a quote from his book. It says, "There's nothing in the traditions of the United States which predisposes them to authoritarianism on the European model. The hysterical anti-communism of the 50s can be seen as a symptom, though an unpleasant and dangerous one, of an ingrained hatred of centralized authority. You can't deny that America did a great job to promote democratic self-determination in Western Europe. Truman, Atkinson, Marshall Aid. There was a kind of arrogant assumption in America's part that she knew best, that God had endowed her with a moral superiority that was the reward of an enlightened democratic tradition. But that's very different from collective tyranny." His critique of the United States collective psyche, presented through a dialogue which appears to be contrived of two Burgess personas, was influenced likely and informed by an American novel that Burgess mentioned quite frequently, and that is Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. So I'm not going to go to that. I'm not going to go into that just to save time because I want to get to a more humorous part. But this is what he says as he kind of sums up 1985, talking about America with this fake American student that's basically him. He says, sharpening his criticism, Burgess, while carrying out a stream of consciousness interview between a Burgess persona and a fictional American interlocutor, goes further to argue that such seemingly un-American attitudes are actually deeply entrenched in the American political and cultural scheme. By using a kind of caricatured American stereotype, both ignorant and jingoistic, as well as provincially intolerant, that is ultimately rooted in some truth. The character goes, core? More than the core. The whole fruit except for the thin skin of liberalism. My old pappy used to say, son, there ain't no good books except the good book. Time these long-haired interluddles got their comeuppance and so on. And so book burning, shooting of radical schoolmasters, censorship of progressive newspapers, every repressive act justified out of the Old Testament and excused jokingly in a good spittoon style. That's Burgess essentially mocking what he saw as the 1960s and 70s. And I will say, too, that he did not kind of waylay his criticism of any of the political leaders at this time. It's very hard to pin down Burgess politically. In many ways, he was conservative, especially fiscally, and in many ways, he would be defined as liberal for today as well. But he criticized basically anybody who was in power. His big thing was that he hates the state. That's what he would say. I hate the state. I don't really care who it is. He said when he was in Europe, he was scared of Jimmy Carter's administration because of the CIA. When he was in the 80s, he said Ronald Reagan is a doofus, basically, who is a failed actor and becomes a politician. And Nixon, he says, is a crook. And goes on to talk about Gerald Ford as well as this silly man who doesn't know about deep ideas. He had the famous statement that truth is glue. And he has a whole poem dedicated to, oh Lord, oh Ford, God help us, also not you. It was in the New York Times. And it was illustrated by Ralph Steadman. Anybody know Ralph? He was illustrated by Ralph Steadman, who did the artwork for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson. If anybody knows, too, Hunter S. Thompson also wrote Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail in 1972 and 73. So Burgess is trying to work within this structure of writers already doing these things, and he's presenting his kind of outsider mentality. So to finish, I'll get to something more humorous other than all this criticism. When in New York City, I was telling Jerry about this the other day, he stayed when he was teaching at CCNY. He taught at CCNY for a year as a distinguished professor. At the same time, he was adjuncting at Columbia University, and he went on to teach at Princeton University for a year. And he was teaching a class on Shakespeare and Joyce, and he stayed in the famous American poet Adrian Rich's apartment, who some of you might know, which calamity ensues. They ultimately did not like each other. If you know anything about Burgess, too, and you know anything about Adrian Rich, you're probably like, those two people probably shouldn't be in the same room. And it kind of went as you'd expect. We won't know the full extent of that until Adrian Rich's papers are released in 2050. They're under lock and key until then. There's probably something about Burgess in there. So Burgess did not save his personal criticisms for his fiction and autobiographies, though, as he was frequently publishing articles in national newspapers, including two comedically cynical, polemical criticisms of New York City, college students, and the United States in the New York Times in October and November of 1972. It is worth noting, too, that Burgess was not the only author in residence at this time, who found the environment at City College of New York to be difficult. His colleague was Joseph Heller, author of Catch-22, who said, reflecting on his time with Burgess at the college in his memoirs, Now and Then in 1998, he said that he admired the way Burgess could take even the most hostile of these students seriously. He knew and remembered their names. He gave serious thought to even the most absurd statements. He wanted to know their backgrounds. In all of my life, even at its most compassionate moments, I have not come close to reaching the enormous inner generosity that characterized the man, Anthony Burgess. Despite the generosity, though, that Heller witnessed, both of Burgess's articles, called Cucarachas in Exile, Potential Death and Life Enhancement, and My Dear Students, caused a stir and elicited the editor responses from fellow New Yorkers. On November 19, 1972, Burgess wrote an open letter called My Dear Students to address the frustrations that would end up being double-voiced and fictionalized in his novel, The Clockwork Testament, and imaginatively recalled in You've Had Your Time, his second autobiography. Calling himself, quote, a temporary professor to feign genuineness in his public letter to his students, Burgess sounds very much like his character Enderby, as he describes witnessing a near illiterate black being allowed credits for soul cooking and bongo drum playing, which he understood as being a result of collegiate standards, which purport that the youth must be served. The ills of the past must be expatiated by a lowering of standards, and professors must be no better than their students. Going on to disparage and discount contemporary writers like Kurt Vonnegut, his soon-to-be successor at City University, and even himself, by stating that students should not study contemporary authors, at least not yet. He attacks the insolence and laxness he saw in contemporary collegiate American education programs that had courses in, quote, classics that asked for no Latin or Greek. Virgil in translation would be good enough, or an in-depth survey of the prosody of Allen Ginsberg. So as the 1970s, clearly there's a covert racism in there, some commentary, but I would caution too that this commentary was something going on all over the place at this period. To what CCNY had done at this time was have open enrollment, one of the first schools in the country to do this, essentially. And I have the actual academic book from CCNY at the time. I found it, digging through all the materials, and it has their mission statement where it says, we're going to do something different. The students who had been barred from college education, we're going to give them a chance, even if they don't have the grades for it. So we're going to let in a population that hasn't seen the kind of gates of higher education yet. And this is the first year that they start this program, and Joseph Heller and Anthony Burgess are there, and Burgess is mad that people aren't reading in the Greek and Latin. So we can see where there was inevitably going to be tons of conflict. I think I get to it in this reading, but maybe not. But there was also an important counterpost to that claim that is presented by a black scholar. He's a professor still living today. I contacted him for the book. He did not reach out to me. I wish that he did, because I wanted to get his side of it. I think his name is Horace Porter, who responded to Burgess in the New York Times and said, in my culture, in this American society that I live in, what is learning Greek and Latin going to do for me reading Virgil? And he says, what I needed to read for this kind of post-Jim Crow era was I needed to read James Baldwin. That's the man. I needed to read Ralph Ellison. I needed to read these authors who gave me an idea of this nightmare landscape that I'm encountering. So it's a very good riposte to Burgess making these assumptions. I'll just leave it at that. I go into it more here. But clearly, too, he also mocks people like Allen Ginsberg, part of the Beat generation. He said, we're going to have a class about Allen Ginsberg? Are you serious? Absolutely not. And he also includes himself. He says we also shouldn't have a class about Anthony Burgess either. But ultimately, that took place. So he said this supposed laxness he saw even in manifesting itself in the undergraduate lifestyle by contributing to the many ills he saw in humanities programs in the American higher education system, going so far as to say that he felt this lethargy of American rigor seeping into its own instruction, permitting a, quote, relaxation of standards that I would never have tolerated while I was a professional teacher. On the Manhattan University campus, Enderby describes the setting as being the center of incorrupt learning that had become a whorehouse of progressive intellectual abdication, where the students or kids had to be pleased, this being a so-called democracy. Courses in soul cookery, whatever that was, and petromusicology, that being teenage garbage now treated as art, and the history of Black slavery and the innumerable branches of a subject called sociology. This leads the narrator, we can assume some sociologists were not happy about that, and Enderby Burgess to believe that such an abdication of duty had resulted in the United States and Americans ignoring and disrespecting history, tradition, and the scaffolding of human knowledge. The past was spat upon, and the future was ready to be spat upon too, since this would quickly enough turn itself into the past. All right, to wrap up, I'll get to this funny little section about this apartment. So, 93rd and Broadway, only 2 blocks from where his fictional character had stayed, just barely disguising the similarities with slight changes and shrinking the more chaotic and expansive events of his life into a controlled autobiographical burlesque that we see in A Clockwork Orange, similar to Jean Cocteau's La Testament d'Orphée. Burgess tries to wrap up these other cultural kind of signifiers in. Also symbolizing possibly in the Clockwork Testament, a reflection on Dante's Inferno, as well as Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. So we can tell that he's thinking very highly of New York at this time. Descending into hell, dying in a place as well. So satirizing and mocking the United States with his famous character, Enderby, FX Enderby. So to those whom the flesh and blood Burgess claims to have bowed his head to and replied with only sullenness and silence in his awkward interactions, he used in his nonfiction and more harshly in his fiction, especially with Enderby and the Clockwork Testament, to take them to task through condescension and ridicule through a distorted hidden polemic, propped up upon real-life personages crafted into barely or clearly caricatures. Another such crucial moment occurs when both the character and creator are scheduled to live in the apartment of a professor who was on sabbatical, which was the actual case while Burgess lived in the poet and teacher Adrienne Rich's apartment, while she was on a year's research leave, which Burgess even suggests was also the apartment Enderby stayed in when he wrote that Enderby was, quote, blamed daily over the telephone, the same way I was for A Clockwork Orange, in Adrienne Rich's flat, which Enderby inhabits alone, masturbating and gorging on the wealth of Manhattan. If you're sorry if you thought you were coming to just a PG-13 reading. Upon moving, I cut out the worst stuff. Upon moving into her apartment, though, it was not politics or activism that drew a dividing line between the two authors. It was cockroaches and rent. While spending her time in Cambridge, Massachusetts for a sabbatical, and knowing about Burgess's upcoming appointment, Rich wrote to Burgess with a suggestion that he should rent her apartment at 670 West End Avenue in New York for $500 a month in rent. Once settled in the Manhattan apartment, having received no mention of cockroaches, when Rich was trying to persuade the Burgesses to move into the property, Burgess and Liana, Burgess's second wife, were disturbed to see a large poster in the street outside their apartment, which advertised in Spanish the services of a cockroach exterminator, only to find their fears confirmed when Rich wrote to them a few weeks later with news that her regular exterminator normally visited on the second Tuesday of each month, and she urged Burgess to put his name down for a visit in order to enjoy a bug-free existence. This was from Dr. Andrew Biswell writing about the subject. This did not sit lightly with the Burgess family, resulting in the aforementioned cucarachas and exiles, New York Times article. And then ultimately, Burgess weaved this idea into the Clockwork Testament. Enderby updates readers on his acclimatization to New York City by expressing that he had, beginning in the second chapter, become, quote, so far as use of the culinary resources of the kitchen, at night the cockroach's playground, were concerned 100% Americanized. New York City citizens responded to the New York Times article swiftly, with the author receiving, as Andrew Biswell explains, a deluge of letters, mostly from his neighbors in the apartment building, who resented him for having revealed their guilty little secret. The enemies in Enderby's building on the same hall and likely resembling Burgess's neighbors are similarly incensed with Enderby over a film attributed to the Deutschland. In the book, Enderby writes the Deutschland, Burgess writes A Clockwork Orange, for which Enderby wrote the screenplay for, and then there was violence that was caused after this. So in fact, an actual neighbor of Burgess's during this time, one Anne McCormick, took writing to the New York Times, appearing in a To the Editor column, where she remarked that contrary to Burgess's statement, the apartment he was in is not on Broadway and 93rd, but in an older cooperative middle-class building on West End Avenue in 93rd, which was not a cotton mill, as he says, nor did it have a sidewalk littered with broken bottles. And there are many tenants who would be glad to help solve his cockroach problem. Burgess replied in the newspaper to Anne McCormick. Burgess provided a reply saying this needlessly grouchy and capious message, retorting that I don't actually live on the corner of 93rd and Broadway, but that's where I ask cab drivers to take me to. The building opposite me looks even more like a broken down Lancashire cotton building, and he had just recently extracted a fragment of broken bottle from my broken shoe. The cockroach problem has, thank you very much, at least been solved. But he summarizes, if that clarification was needed, perhaps my view of a broken down district differs radically from that of Mrs. McCormick. But I do know that in London, the bulldozer would already be at work, ending rhetorically that if this is urban renewal, what is New York dilapidation like? All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Probably more reading than you wanted to listen to, but so thank you. Yes, if there are questions, yeah.
So anyway, congratulations on the publication.
Yes, thank you.
We're definitely lucky that you here for us. My question is something that you and I talked about quite a bit, and it's routine. And that's authors, scientists, what their routines are. He's obviously prolific. Was his routine rigid? Is that routine rigid, or was it more haphazard?
Rigid. He made comments that when I borrowed that book from you, I was hoping it had a section on Burgess. He talks about his process. He would essentially, this probably changed throughout his life. He said, if I can get anywhere from, I think he says 3,000 words a day done before noon, then I can spend the rest of the day living my life. And what that meant for Burgess was smoking a lot, drinking a lot. Until later in his life when he stopped drinking because it was just too hard on him. But that's what the rest of the day was. And there are many comments too where people would say, I went out for a drink with Burgess, which turned into 47 gin and tonics, out until 4 a.m. And then he'd say he would go back and cook dinner and wake up at 6 a.m. to start his writing process. So he clearly had apparently no hangover problem as well, but it was every day he had to produce something. If it wasn't music, it was an article. If it wasn't an article, it was a book. If it wasn't fiction, it was nonfiction. It was quite voluminous. Yeah.
That his ultimate boogeyman was the state.
Yes.
Right, and he lived a lot of places. Was he equally critical of those places and their setups as America?
Yeah, he was definitely prone to Europeanism. I mean, he constantly would say, I'm European in blood. Like I operate in this section. Another humorous little section I took out where he says, I got messages from Americans telling me they were going to kill me and I should go back to my country just for saying that there should be socialized medicine. He's like, I don't know what this issue is, but yes, he would criticize the other countries. There are many articles written that he knew French. There were articles in French that he wrote criticizing French politics structure, Swiss, because he lived in Switzerland. There's tons of criticism all over. He spent more time in America, though, and I think was more engaged with all the speaking engagements and things that he had, that he felt that he was more provoked to give more criticism. I would say America and England are the ones who received the most criticism. He had a lot of problems with England. as well, which basically those two places are where he spent the most time. So that would make sense. But one of the biggest ones too, another kind of humorous element. There's many humorous elements in Burgess's life, and that's why I have found his literature to be so funny too. It's very dark, but very funny. In Malta, he had his house seized for pornographic novels, quote unquote. And some of the documents they seized were like, lingerie catalogs for the local store and stuff. And there was a novel that he had. I think it was by the author of The Godfather. It had like a provocative title. It was the 60s. There were a lot of like naked women on covers and stuff. And he said they took that book. There's not a single sex scene or anything in the whole. They just saw a body and said it's obscene. So he said all of this was ridiculous and lambasted the state of Malta and said it's ridiculous. I'm never going to live there again. And they sold his home in Legia. Yeah. So.
What was this children's book about?
A long trip to tea time.
Was it a superhero?
No, I've read it. It's not for children. If you know anything, but it's not because of being lewd or anything. It's about like relativity, which you probably wouldn't have guessed. It's like a time traveling kid. So at first you're kind of like, okay, my 8-year-old might get this. And then it's this kind of digression about relativity of time and so on. You're like, where are you going, Burgess? Well, you're losing the 6-year-old audience. So no, I remember when I was at the foundation, I think it was Andrew, Dr. Biswell said, are you going to read your daughter A Long Trip to Tea Time? I was like, I could, she's not going to understand a word of it or care. So I was like, no, I don't think it's very successful as a children's book. He had another one too. He had, what is it? On Sleep, but it's about sleep habits, about people all over the world too. One of the jokes about Burgess that people mocked him for is being too prodigious. He would write about anything. It was like, oh, what's Burgess up to? He's writing about the history of sleep now? Cool. Like, why are we going to this man? But yeah, basically, if something came across his desk, he would be like, yeah, sure, I can write 1,000 pages about this. Which one of his advisors, one of his literary advisors said, you can put the word no in your vocabulary. That's a possibility. You can say no to some of these things. Oh, yeah. Any other questions? No, I could go on for days. So, all right, wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it.